Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here as always with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at The Wall Street Journal, and Distinguished Fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. President Biden called this week for a constitutional amendment overturning the Supreme Court's recent decision awarding former presidents immunity for crimes they commit while in office, and endorsed proposals for a mandatory ethics code and 18-year term limit for justices. He cited decisions that the court's right-leaning majority views as landmark achievements, including the overturning of Roe v. Wade, Chevron deference, and affirmative action in college admissions. There's little chance Biden's measures will advance before the November elections, according to the Wall Street Journal. But with public approval of the court at historic lows, Democrats believe the proposals will resonate with voters. Vice President Kamala Harris, the likely Democratic nominee for president, issued a statement backing Biden's proposals. Walter, news or faux news?
That's pretty much faux news, I'm afraid. The chance, first of all, I don't even think they're going to be able to draft a constitutional amendment that would define just what you can and can't prosecute a president for. That's really a very, very tricky, dicey task, and I think it will fail. And then if they did draft it, I'm quite sure you would not be able to pass it, to ratify. Beyond that, 18-year term limits, I mean, there's nothing sort of, you would actually need to, I believe, to amend the Constitution to do that. As a Constitution talks about life tenure or tenure during good behavior for justices. Maybe you could define good behavior as voting the way I like. So that also seems like a pretty unlikely thing. And even if you did it, you certainly couldn't apply it retroactively to sitting judges, which would mean that it would be 18 years before it would have any visible impact on anything happening in the court. So this is really about as worthless a piece of demagoguery as you're going to see. I shouldn't say that. Donald Trump is, after all, running on the other side. So we're going to get quite a bit on all sides in the next few months. The other thing is, at least as I've looked at the polls, the fall off in the court's popularity is pretty much entirely among Democrats. You know, independents actually have not really changed their views of the court, and Republicans maybe, if anything, be more favorable. So this really just feels like wheel spinning and throwing chum to the base. Now that's part of a presidential campaign, but it's not the most elevated or respectable part of a presidential campaign.
How normal is this throughout American history to see, the party who's kind of politically not being favored by the makeup of the current court offering reforms to pack it or whatever? I feel like this has been happening most of my life, but is this a kind of regular occurrence throughout American history?
Yeah. Certainly in the 60s, it was usually in those days, it was the right that hated the Earl Warren Supreme Court, whether it was, for some people, it was the decisions on race, certainly the Miranda decision on rights of criminal suspects, but maybe even more than all of those, banning prayer in public schools really lit a fire. And you couldn't have a session of Congress without, some tribune of the people saying, we got to do something about the Supreme Court. And you've seen it again. You can go back a lot farther than that. Roosevelt during the New Deal. Everybody who doesn't like the status quo throws bricks at the Supreme Court, which is one of the reasons that we don't elect our judges. We want to give them a little insulation from this popular protest.
All right, our second story. The vast majority, 86%, of current renters in the United States say they would like to buy a home but can't afford one, according to a CNN poll conducted by SSRS released this week. Among those same renters who can't afford to buy a home right now, 54% think it's unlikely they'll ever be able to. The findings underscore the damage done by the 1-2 punch of surging home prices and elevated mortgage rates, creating an affordability crisis. Younger people especially are having trouble buying a home right now. The CNN poll found that 90% of renters younger than 45 say they'd like to buy but can't afford it, compared with 79% of those aged 45 and above. Walter, news or faux news?
This is news, and it's big news. And it's news that both parties need to think hard about, and anybody who cares about the future of the United States should care about. Now, some of that, by the way, there is a piece of faux news in there. This is not actually driven by unaffordable mortgage rates. By historical standards, mortgage rates right now are not high. They were much, much higher than this when the baby boom generation was looking at houses back in the 1970s and early 1980s. So they're only high by the abnormally low standards of the last few years. That makes the affordability crisis that much worse. We really need to change this. And again, the fact that the average American, overwhelmingly 80% of people want to own a home. People understand the importance of home ownership for wealth accumulation, family stability. Even if it's a little thing about, wanting to be able to repaint the place you live and control the appearance of the place you live and make additions and renovations and all these things. These are all very natural, reasonable things that people want to do. And the American government, for most of our history, the one thing it's been pretty good at is giving the average American a shot at owning the place where they live. For the first 150 years of our history, this was mostly in terms of the family farm, that unlike European countries where the average person was a peasant who had to pay all kinds of rent to landlords and feudal barons and whatnot, American farmers owned their own homes. They were business people, entrepreneurs, and property owners. It made them smarter citizens. It also made them better off. And then in the 20th century, when we shifted away from being an agricultural society, we figured out how to make suburban home ownership the norm for new generations of America. And you look at the growth of American middle class wealth since World War II, and you'll see that the vast bulk of it is in home equity. This is the most far-reaching social program, maybe except for public education, that the country has. And we're getting it wrong. And as far as I can tell, neither party has really made this as a priority. If you want to understand visibly why the American elite today is underperforming past generations and why it is so separated from the population at large that it's really unable to understand and deal with the problems of ordinary life as the average American family experiences them, I don't think you can find a better example than this. It is not impossible to make affordable home ownership real in America again. It's a question of land use regulations, building codes, restrictions on development of certain types of land. There's a lot we could do that doesn't even cost the government money. So big news that we have this problem. In a way, it's even bigger and sadder news that we're not doing very much about it. But the best news is that if we wanted to, we could fix this.
Do you think there's a role for the federal government in deregulating some of those constraints you just mentioned that restrict the housing supply, or is this mostly a state and local issue?
A lot of it is state and local, but you look at some of the Western states, there's an awful lot of federal land out there. And I would think it could be a very interesting thing to look at how do you apply the spirit of the old Homestead Act to some of that federal land that's out there today. Are there that was originally, if you went out there and you built a farm on it or you dug a little mine or something on it and you lived there for 5 years, it was yours free. Is there anything we could do today along those lines? But beyond that, I think the federal government could be helpful in proposing a model land code, land use code. And so again, it's all building codes are really complicated because if you're in Maine, you need a building code that actually makes sense in the winter. If you're in Louisiana, you need things that make sense for hurricanes and swamps. In California, you're worrying about earthquakes and fires, not to mention the occasional flood and landslide. So you can't just have a simple federal code that everybody would have to live with. And again, like some states are poorer than other states. So the trade-off between how much you want to regulate land use and home construction, and how much you want to err in the side of making things cheaper might be different from state to state. But there are states, and we mentioned California among them, where I think the starter home price is now some ridiculous number like $800,000. This is criminal misconduct. It's the kind of thing that a lot of our ancestors might have overthrown a government rather than suffer through. And if I were a young person with political ambitions, and I'm an old person without political ambitions, so take this for what it's worth, I would think about starting a state political party or a movement in a state political party that focused like a laser on a program to basically vote yourself a house. You elect me and my allies and supporters. We will pass legislation that will enable the average American family to buy an average American home.
All right, final story of the week. A viral video this week showed rebel fighters, rifles slung over their shoulders, stepping among more than a dozen bodies strewn across the sand and rocks. The scene was from another battle in the vast deserts of northern Mali, except that this time the victims were Russians. Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group appear to have been attacked as they were accompanying Malian government troops on patrol near the Algerian border, a vast forbidding region where jihadi groups have long been active. According to some unofficial Russian telegram channels, as many as 80 Russians were killed. That would make it by far the worst loss for Russian paramilitaries in several years of operating in Africa, as the Kremlin has sought to use proxy forces to challenge Western influence across the Sahel and Central Africa and prop up unstable regimes. Walter, news or faux news?
Oh, I think it's news. We need to see, and again, one of the mysteries of world politics today is how, while fighting the Ukraine war, Vladimir Putin has been able to engage in the biggest imperial adventure in Africa since the European powers divided up the continent in 1890. He's been able to insert his agents of influence into government after government, bringing nothing, as far as I can see, but war and polarization, theft, plutocracy, kleptocracy, all of these things, and in a band stretching more or less across the Sahel and pumping billions of dollars and gold and oil and uranium, apparently, and all kinds of resources into Russia, helping to prop up Putin's government at home and feed the Russian war machine. As far as I can tell, Washington has basically sat on its hands and written beautiful, beautiful platitudes about the importance of democracy and peace. This is a spineless exhibition. If we are serious about what Russia is doing to threaten the foundations of a peaceful world, and yet we are utterly indifferent to strategic expansions of Russian influence in weak and vulnerable states in Africa, we're just not serious. We deserve whatever's coming to us. We need to, now I don't believe, sadly, that this latest misfortune for Wagner was actually something the U.S. had a hand in. Maybe, maybe not. I have seen reports of Ukrainian troops involved, Ukrainian special forces involved. That would be a good thing. But we need to make Africa a living hell for Vladimir Putin's allies. If we are serious about ending the war in Ukraine on good terms and stopping Putin's threat to the balance of power in Europe and to the post-World War II American-led world order. This is an easy place to act. We so far are not. But fortunately, some of the forces, Africa is not always a benign operating environment. and the impact of Wagner on Africa is to make it on these countries is to make them more dangerous and less stable. And now some chickens are coming home to roost for Mr. Putin. I'm sorry for the families of the combatants, the Wagner people. I'm sorry that where anybody is dying in this world, but you really shouldn't have the idea that imperial adventures in the 21st century are cost free.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. So, Walter, Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, is dead. Early in the morning on Wednesday, the Palestinian terror group announced that Haniyeh had been killed in an Israeli airstrike in Tehran, shortly after attending a swearing-in ceremony for the new Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian. Pezeshkian, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps have all vowed revenge. The assassination of Haniyeh, the highest-level Hamas figure to be killed since October 7th, was the second in a brutal 1-2 punch delivered by the Israelis late Tuesday and early Wednesday in retaliation for Hezbollah's killing of 12 children in northern Israel over the weekend. Hours earlier, the Israelis had killed Fuad Shukr, the number 3 man in Hezbollah and the group's top military commander, in an airstrike in Beirut, a target that the Biden administration had explicitly warned Jerusalem against striking. Walter, how does this not affect the trajectory of events in the region and also policy in Washington?
Well, what it ought to do is bring peace closer in the region. But for that to happen, the United States would have to step in and back Israel's play to some degree. I see the Wall Street Journal editorial board has come out with an editorial saying that it really thinks the United States should be doubling down on warning Iran not to retaliate, warning that Iranian retaliation on Israel could threaten a wider war that might bring the U.S. engaged and so on. I think that makes sense. Again, not because our goal is to have a war with Iran, but because up until now, whenever faced with real force and real determination, the Ayatollahs, who know Iran is a weak country, where the government is hated by the population, the economy is a mess, as we see from Israel's ability to strike a high-profile visitor at a very, very high-profile moment in Iran, the Iranian secret services are filled with leakers, infiltrators, double agents, spies. It's a rotten, stinking mess. All right? The Ayatollah knows this. The supreme leader knows this and is not really in much of a risk-taking mood. Sadly, I think, in Washington, we're still, we spend all our time agonizing about what they might do. What if we do X, what would the Iranians do? And then blah, 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 and sure, you need to be cautious and you certainly need to think things through, look before you leap. But actually, what we see is in our failure to deal in a more straightforward way with the Iranians, what do we see? They armed Hamas. They trained Hamas. They gave Hamas the sense that it had the backing of a superpower or a regional power if it launched a war with Israel. They then somewhat betrayed Hamas, but okay, well, that's life in the Middle East. They have turned Hezbollah into one of the most formidable forces in the region, stronger than many states, and certainly better armed than almost any state in the region. They've converted the Houthis from ragtag militias in Yemen into a force that's been able to close the Red Sea, laugh at the United States, laugh at the international community as they shut down a vital artery that endangers the economic and social stability of a country as important as Egypt. This is madness. Our policy of, dilly-dallying and shilly-shallying, temporizing, kicking the can down the road is just bringing Iran closer to nuclear weapons and allowing Iran to continue to build up its proxy empire in the region. It is disheartening our allies and potential allies, encouraging our enemies, and I think leading the Iranians to what will ultimately prove to be, for them, disastrous miscalculations. As I said about Putin, we're not serious yet. We are sort of watching these sort of little brush fires around the edges of the world order. And as they grow, we're telling ourselves, oh, they're still really quite small, and we might burn our finger if we tried to deal with them. Let's just, maybe they'll burn out of their own accord. And anyway, who cares about, the Sahel? Who really cares about Yemen? I mean, really, the Red Sea, it's not that vital a waterway. You can still go around the Cape of Good Hope, et cetera, et cetera. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. This is, I hate to say this, and people overuse this comparison, but it is not unlike the 1930s. We looked at Japan running around in China. We looked at Mussolini in Ethiopia, then Hitler in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and so on. And we sort of let things go until we were faced with a massive conflagration that we could not extinguish without losing something like 450,000 American lives and many times that number of foreign military and civilian casualties. War is a terrible thing. That's why you need to think really hard about stopping it and preventing it. So far, I'm afraid that, again, our leadership elite is kind of like trustafarians. We inherited this huge trust fund from our grandparents who won World War II. And yeah, we noticed that we're spending it down, and there's some odd little market fluctuations every now and then, kind of a cash crunch, but we still don't actually believe that anything really bad could happen. And that's a mistake. Because what was it? The Hemingway character said, you go bankrupt in two ways: first gradually, then suddenly. And that's what can happen to an international order, to a framework of peace, to the Pax Americana. Is it can deteriorate very, very slowly for a very long period of time, and then suddenly you kind of step into the abyss. We're not there yet. And it is not inevitable that that's where we're going, but we are coming closer and closer to the time when we won't be able to stop this process of disintegration without genuinely heroic measures. Now, I think, again, Israel's actions in the Middle East provide the foundation for a very stern warning to Iran and to Hezbollah and to Hamas and to their friends like Qatar, that actually our patience has run out. And we are no longer prepared to tolerate and live with this kind of activity. We have allies there like Israel, like the Saudis, like others, who care as much or more about the state of the Middle East as we do. We can achieve our goals by supporting and backing them rather than doing everything ourselves for now. But the time may come when we've lost that option.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. You've been in Paris the last couple weeks, Walter, to watch your nephew row for the USA in the Olympics. So this week, tell us what your tips are for attending the Olympics.
In general, my number one tip is stay home. The Olympics are much better watched from, in a comfortable room, climate control room with a nice big TV screen where you get great high-def pictures of everything that's happening. Now, I will say that some of the people I've talked to tell me the beach volleyball is worth attending. I'm sure that is entirely due to the athletic nature of the contest. And it's been kind of fun walking around the streets of Paris, and suddenly you see like a horde of bicyclers passing through, or swimmers in the sand. It's not a bad thing to be in a city where the Olympics are happening, but to basically sit out and bake in the hot sun while things often move slowly, I don't recommend it. I really don't recommend it. But in my case, I've got a nephew. Nick Mead is rowing for the United States. He's in the men's four, and after he's been doing this since he was in school. So school, college, and then afterwards rode in the Tokyo Olympics. This is probably his last race. There's no way I'm not going to be here for that. But I'm coming as family, not coming as, one who loves spectator sports.
All right. Well, best of luck to Nick. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.